Dr. Will Tregoning is basically runs a drug law reform group called Unharm, and he's also co-founder of the drug checking organisation, The Loop Australia. So just as there's been like major evolution really to do with regulations about cannabis, there's also been a lot of great sort of achievements and evolutions to do with, for instance, pill testing at festivals and things like that. So Will's been a part of that. In Will's talk today, he's going to share the results of some research that Unharm have been undertaking on the types of messages that persuade people. I said before politicians, but you're talking about beyond that as well, like the general community, to really support legalisation of psychedelics and cannabis. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thank you. Great to be here. I'll start by acknowledging that we are on stolen land and pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their custodianship over countless generations. I am going to be talking about messages that convince the public to support cannabis legalisation. And this is based on some research that my organisation Unharm did last year. I want to start, as always, just by giving a bit of context for who I am and why I'm here. And before I do that, though, if the house lights are able to be turned on, I would really welcome that. It's nice to be able to see people. Not sure if that's an option. I am a person who has, plenty of lived experience with drug use. It was part of my experience as a young person, in particular, in the bars and clubs of Sydney. The thing that really struck me from that experience was how common it was for me to bump into people I'd been to school with, or people essentially like me using drugs, and it was different from the expectations I'd had as a young person. I thought, wow, all these privileged kids use drugs. I thought it was some sort of fringe phenomenon, but no, just like me, it was a very common sort of experience. Now, I later went and worked for government as a consultant, a research consultant in the alcohol and other drug space, and I was very often in meetings with bureaucrats talking about drug policy and programs. And in those contexts, they'd often talk about drug use as if it was this remote phenomenon that went out there somewhere in society, not something that people like us would do. And I'd seen the data by this point. I knew that if you're a tertiary educated middle-class person, more likely than not, you have some life experience of illegal use of drugs. And so I'd look around the room thinking, I'm pretty sure some of you are bullshitting. And it struck me that there, right where policy and programs were being designed and evaluated, there was this culture of dishonesty. Now, around the same time, I moved to Sydney's King's Cross and saw the reality of what drug law enforcement looks like in a community like that, where a person like me is essentially invisible to the police. But continuously, I'd be walking past these scenes where Aboriginal people, or essentially where police are profiling based on race and poverty. And those are the people stopped and searched continually on the streets of my suburb. I thought, well, this is not something I'm prepared to walk past anymore. And so that's why I started this organisation called Unharm, which is the organisation that did the research I'll be talking about today. So who are we? We are, I'm talking to you with the assumption that you are people who support legalisation. We're people who want to see change on this issue, and we're in a moment where the opportunity for change, I think, is better than ever. A majority of Australians support the legalisation of cannabis, and we're seeing that have an impact on on parliaments around Australia with the election of candidates and now MPs who support cannabis law reform. So in this moment of opportunity, the purpose of this research is to find the ways to most effectively reach the persuadable people in the middle. Not necessarily the people for whom cannabis is a hot button issue, but the approximately 2/3 of people who can be swayed either to be our supporters or opponents, depending on how the issue is framed to them. All right, I'll briefly give you an overview of the methodology, just so you can see that this was quite a deep piece of research. We started with an analysis of the way cannabis legalisation had been advocated for in other countries. Mostly successful campaigns, but we also looked at some of the unsuccessful ones, like in New Zealand. Then we conducted focus groups where we talked with advocates who were often making the case for legalisation to hear how they framed the issue. And we used all of that to inform the design of a questionnaire that then we took to a panel of 1,000 Victorians. This was focused on Victoria in the lead up to the Victorian election. 1,000 people who represent a representative sample of the general population, to ask them about their attitudes to cannabis and to cannabis, or how they respond to messages about legalisation. All right. This is a good news presentation. The overall finding, to an extent that surprised me, to be honest, is that people are open-minded and persuadable about cannabis legalisation. They don't hold particularly strong views around this issue, but there's very few people who hold the strong view that people who use cannabis should be criminalised. The other thing that I think is perhaps the most exciting finding from this research is when we put our messages head-to-head with prohibitionist messages, our messages won every single time. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation, but essentially in part of the research, what we do is we ask people to select from one of two messages which one they support most. And that's what I'm talking about in saying that the pro-legalisation messages beat prohibitionist messages every time. But it's not all good news. You can clearly see in people's attitudes to cannabis that there's an impact from the years and years of conservative rhetoric, both from politicians, media, and from the police. Most people, and even some of our supporters, even the people who are on our side, believe cannabis is harmful. And secondly, and this is at least as important, for most people, cannabis legalisation is not an issue that they feel strongly about. They've got 99 problems, and the criminalisation of cannabis use is not, for most people, in the top 99. Sorry, I'm running off two computers. I just need to make sure I'm advancing at the same time. All right. One of the key findings about messaging, especially when we looked at how pro-legalisation messages are sometimes framed by our allies, what we found is that pro-legalisation messages often focus on whether cannabis is good or bad. And in a similar way, the prohibitionist messages tend to focus on the harms of cannabis and put that at the centre of the discussion. Our recommendation, based on this research and on essentially messaging science, is that we need to reframe the debate to put the focus on whether criminalising cannabis is good or bad. And when we put messages like that to those persuadable people in the middle that redefine the problem as the criminalisation of cannabis, it resonates, it makes sense to people. Persuadable people also agree with messages about the benefits of legalisation, and I will talk a little bit more about that in the presentation to give you some examples. So, in a nutshell, what I'm going to be talking about today is these recommendations. Reframe the debate away from whether cannabis is good or bad. We can't win on that terrain. You just get locked in endless discussions about cannabis, whereas what we need to do is focus on the criminalisation of cannabis as the problem we're solving. And in terms of creating common ground, use broadly shared values like care, being helpful, fairness and justice. It's also really important to identify the people responsible for keeping cannabis illegal. Make that concrete for members of the public. And the impact that it has on actual people's lives. And personal stories are really an important part of that. In addition to that, bring the benefits of legalisation into the frame. Now, to an extent that I was surprised by, people understand the benefits of legalisation, and I'll give you some specific examples of that. Messages about that are really persuasive. First up, part of the research was to understand our key, understand the people whom we're trying to persuade. Now, I've made a few references to persuadable people, and this is based on the idea that there are three groups, broadly speaking, in the population. There are people like us, the supporters, people who are on board with the idea of cannabis legalisation. We're about 15 to 20% of the population, the absolute rusted on the base. Then there are about a similar number of people who are our die-hard opponents, who, regardless of the message, won't support cannabis legalisation. But the biggest group of people are the people in the middle. People who, depending on how the message is put to them, can swing either way. And that's about 60% of people in Victoria, and that kind of proportion will be repeated in other states. Now, I don't have time to talk about all the detail of what we found about key audiences. I just want to give you the most important message, which is this. There are huge similarities between the different segments of people, the different groupings based on demographic characteristics. There are huge similarities between the different groupings of people who support legalisation. Legalisation is not an issue that actually divides people strongly on the basis of some of the traditional political fault lines, like age, gender, or class. So we see supporters who vote for the Liberal National Party. There's a quite substantial number of people in the persuadable group there, relatively small opposition. That kind of pattern obviously, increases slightly in terms of building supporters. You move towards the political left, but actually the differences are not very stark. And this is one of the reasons why there's such an opportunity. While it might feel like cannabis law reform is the train that never comes, the fact that it's not dividing people around those political fault lines is a huge opportunity. The opposition, we're not going to get caught in a culture wars type dynamic like some other issues, for example, climate politics do. Again, I'll just very briefly talk through some of the attitudes of the key audience. We asked a whole lot of things about their attitudes to cannabis and their attitudes to cannabis, to people who use cannabis, as well as their attitudes to cannabis laws. The most important finding here is that persuadable people are apprehensive about cannabis. They're not generally cannabis fans, but they just don't think people should be criminalised for it. And so in thinking about the audience, I think this is the most important characteristic to keep in mind. Okay, so now the good bit. What are the messages that win? These are the messages that work in persuading those people in the middle to support legalisation. I'm going to read out some of these messages. Obviously, you can see some of them are quite extended, but it will give you a sense of what we tested. Now, this is an example of a question where we put... This is an example of a question where we put two messages head to head. On the left, you've got a message, a pro-reform message. On the right, you've got an opposition message. Now, the finding here is that persuadable people want people to be able to access cannabis without fear of police prosecution. This was the strongest testing pro-legalisation message of all the ones we tested, supported by 2/3 of people in that persuadable group. So the opposition message here is cannabis is a dangerous drug that harms both the user and our community. It causes mental health issues and increases fatal car crashes. Legalising cannabis would send the wrong message and encourage people to use it. You've probably heard that kind of thing. Well, the encouraging thing here is that only 35% of people supported that message when it was put head to head with this one. People should have access to the best tools available to manage their health and well-being. Growing numbers of people from all walks of life are using cannabis for the variety of benefits it can bring, from reducing pain or nausea to managing anxiety. But the current laws in Victoria treat them like criminals and make it difficult for people to access cannabis safely. Legalising cannabis will help people safely access the tools and support they need to look after their own health and happiness. 2/3 of people in that persuadable group come with us when they hear that message. One of the other exciting findings here was that messages about the benefits of legalisation generate high rates of agreement among this persuadable group. So, when we put it to people that legalisation would make it easier and safer for people who use cannabis medically to access it, nearly 70% agreed. A similar proportion agreed with the fact that cannabis legalisation would improve quality standards, would provide more control of sales, including making it harder for young people to access cannabis, and 70% agreed that a benefit of legalisation would be to take cannabis out of, to take organised crime out of the equation and generate tax revenue for more government services. 70% agreement. In addition, messages about the harms of criminalising cannabis also generated really high rates of agreement among the persuadable group. So messages like this: lots of people are benefiting from using cannabis to treat health problems, but the government still wants police to arrest them if they grow their own. By legalising cannabis, we can make sure more people enjoy the benefits of cannabis without the fear of police persecution. 68% agreed. And when politicians criminalise cannabis, they create more harm than the drug itself. Victorian police arrest thousands of people every year for using cannabis, giving them a permanent criminal record that limits their opportunities in life. Again, 2/3 of voters agreed in that persuadable group. One other message that I really want to highlight is this one. We have done a lot of work over the last couple of years in trying to building better links between racial justice, especially racial justice as it relates to First Nations people in this country, and drug law reform. This is important work that has been done, in my view, too little by the drug reform movement. So we've done a lot of work engaging with people who work in Aboriginal justice organisations to hear from them what their priorities are and how they perceive the issue. One of the clearest messages from those conversations was the call for us to talk about the criminalisation of cannabis use in a way that explicitly highlights the racial injustice in the way that the laws are enforced. And as a side note to that, we're just recently used freedom of information laws to request data from New South Wales Police, who are now collecting race data about all offences that they record, and that includes drug offences. And we assumed there would be a racial, there would be evidence of racial discrimination in that data, but it's eye-popping. The rate of arrests of Aboriginal people for cannabis offences in this state are extraordinary, and it differs by police area command, but at the highest, in the highest area, they account for 60% of all cannabis consumer arrests. Okay, so that's why we tested messages like these. People from all walks of life can use cannabis for a variety of reasons, from relaxation to pain management. But the way our criminal justice system and police treat people who use cannabis varies dramatically based on where you live and the colour of your skin. People of colour and Aboriginal people are far more likely to be targeted by police for using cannabis than white people in wealthier neighbourhoods who use it too. Legalising cannabis would help us build a fairer and more just society. 59% agree, and only 49% agreed with this opposition message about how the growing evidence about the harms of cannabis in places that have legalised it shows how dangerous that would be. That message didn't beat this racial justice message. Okay, so now some of the bad news, I guess, or some of the things to keep in mind when thinking about how to persuade people is that there are some important barriers. One of them is, perhaps the most important one, is that for most people, cannabis is not a high priority issue. So it'll be hard to get them engaged. The second one is, and this won't be news to you, police have a powerful media presence, and they've effectively framed this issue around the harms of cannabis. And this is reflected in the views of many people. You can see that in people's attitudes and concerns that they have about cannabis. Because of that, people are really susceptible to opposition arguments against legalisation that are framed in terms of the harmfulness of cannabis. For example, this statement generated really high agreement among that persuadable group in the middle, the people who we'd like to have on our team. Well, 2/3 of them agreed with this message. Cannabis can cause psychosis, especially among young people. We shouldn't risk the mental health of our youth by legalising cannabis. So about 2/3 of that persuadable group agreed. Summing all that up, some key recommendations from this research. We need to neutralise the key opposition arguments by focusing on the harms of criminalisation rather than on whether cannabis is good or bad. We need to bring the benefits of legalisation into the frame, including improved quality control, restrictions on sales to young people, revenue for government services, and people being able to pursue their goals in life without the burden of a criminal record. In addition, and this is a general recommendation, we need to use powerful personal stories that capture people's imagination to motivate supporters and shift that persuadable group to our side. Now, what we've done in this next section is to turn what we learned into some suggestions about how to frame the story about cannabis legalisation in a way that makes sense to that persuadable group. Now, these are ideas about how to tell that story based on the research. We're at this really exciting stage where we know that these messages are cutting through, and combined with that shift in the political context, there's this real opportunity for change. So this section is not just me kind of lecturing you, it's also an invitation to provide feedback or to be part of this process of taking what we know and turning it into compelling narratives. Okay, this suggested framing narrative is based on an idea that the way to effectively communicate in stories that bring people, that persuade people and bring them to your side is to start by expressing shared values that they can connect with, to identify a villain who's putting those values at risk, and then a action that people can take in order to overcome the negative impacts of that villain and the problems they're creating, and then a vision of how the world will be better that reflects those shared values that you started with. Okay, so with that in mind, we recommend starting framing narratives about cannabis legalisation in terms of these broadly held values like care and being helpful, like we all want to live in a society where we're supported to be who we want to be. Or fairness and justice, like no matter the colour of your skin, our postcode, or what's in our wallet, we all deserve to be treated fairly and with respect. Next, and this is something that some people sometimes feel a little bit reticent to do, but it's absolutely crucial. Unless members of the public, unless our audiences can understand that the problems that we're trying to address actually got created by people, they didn't just somehow develop out of the ether, out of some disembodied political process, they were actually caused by people, it makes it seem much more possible that people can actually change the status quo. And so it's really important to identify villains, the people who are responsible for the status quo, with statements like this. Our governments arrest thousands of people every year just for using cannabis. They're serving their own political agenda rather than listening to the evidence, experts, and the community. Or police. Police arrest thousands of people every year just for using cannabis. They campaign in the media and pressure our politicians to keep cannabis illegal. It helps keep their budgets big and gives them an excuse to stop and search whomever they want. It's also really crucial that people can actually feel the impact, so that it's not just abstract ideas, but that it's actually grounded in people's lives. So add detail about the real life impacts of the problem, like it's Aboriginal people, young people, and homeless people who are disproportionately targeted. Or a cannabis arrest jeopardises people's education and employment prospects. Or the threat of an arrest makes people who are experiencing a problem with their cannabis use scared to reach out for help. These help people to understand the problem, not just in abstract policy terms, but in terms that they're much more likely to care about, which is in people's actual lives. And then finally, give people a sense of the better world that we can create through taking action. So describe the action that we can take to overcome the barrier. For example, that's why we need to work together to demand our government commits to legalising cannabis, and then the positive outcomes that we can achieve. Legalising cannabis will make our state a fairer place for all of us and help people take care of themselves and their communities. Or legalising cannabis will mean people who use cannabis can live full and happy lives without the fear of arrest or the burden of a criminal record. Some final thoughts. So to me, this research was really exciting, and that's not just because we did it, it's because the results were striking in how clearly our messages beat opposition messages. Most people support or are open-minded to cannabis more people support or are open-minded to cannabis legalisation than ever before, and our messages are clearly beating opposition messages. We think it's a really promising path forward in this moment where, like I said, political opportunities are better than ever. And in a sense, this presentation is an invitation to people like you to be part of this process of crafting effective messages that move that persuadable group to our side. If there's something in the presentation today that you'd like to ask about, by all means, I'd love to answer your questions. You're also very welcome to get in touch, and I put my email on the screen there, will@unharm.org. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Will. We have some time for some questions or comments. Does anyone have anything to add? I was going to, as you were talking about different persuasive arguments, I was thinking of in the United States with the rollout of recreational cannabis legalisation, that sometimes, I think it was Colorado had the message to treat cannabis like alcohol. So they took another kind of, socially acceptable inebriant and said, hey, you can tax it and treat it like alcohol. Was that something that was that is part of your strategy or suggestions as well?
It's a great question. Something that we thought about quite a bit because, that was definitely, especially in Colorado, where Marijuana Policy Project used exactly that message. Some of the analysis, and I think some of the most robust analysis of the political change process in the US is quite quite dismissive, I guess, of the impact of that message or its importance in actually driving the change. I think, and there are quite rigorous pieces of analysis that have been done about the campaign processes in the United States, where other messages like, rightly or wrongly, this might not be your favourite message, but restricting sales to young people or enabling tax revenue to flow back to health and education services were actually, according to this research, responsible for more of that shift in public perception than the messages around the equivalence between alcohol and cannabis. One of our concerns is we don't really want to start a fight about the different regulatory models between alcohol and cannabis, and so given that there are, in addition, other ways that we can move the persuadable group to our side, it's not something that we'd recommend focusing on.
And I guess the difference with the US as well was pretty much they were persuading voters within a state because that's how they made the legislative changes. So it was really, yes, persuading voters.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot. It is definitely a very different political process in the US. That it was like they were more like a marriage equality referendum in terms of like how the political change happened. But in terms of having to engage a broad cross section of the population and move them to our side and mobilise a sufficient number of them to actually put pressure on politicians to make politicians see this as an issue they can't ignore. In that sense, there's a lot of similarity between what had to happen in the US and what our task is here.
Hey, Will, Andrew. Great presentation. Very pertinent after just going through an election and going through the conversations that you've had. Did you ask any questions around freedom of choice, and how did they, if you did, how did they measure up?
Yeah, we definitely did. And there's another part of this research that we do on a continual basis, which is to, we use advertising on social media to identify the kinds of messages that most effectively mobilise the base, so the people who are our supporters. And we definitely try freedom messages in that context. They do work. That is effective in particular mobilising our supporters into taking action as part of a campaign, signing a petition, that kind of thing. Having said that, freedom-type messages are so politically complex, I think, in the Australian context right now, especially post-COVID, that we think that it's not the right way to build. So there's a complexity that comes from that context. But in addition to that, what we need to do is to find reasons to legalise cannabis that connect with that group in the middle. And we think it's just easier to do that on the fairness and justice messages rather than on the freedom messages, because they are much more readily, they lend themselves much more readily to be able to bring a big group of people to their side. Freedom is a very important and very politically contested term in the Australian political and in many other countries' context right now.
Yeah, and I thought that myself, but I was just wondering, because it wasn't mentioned in any of the questions, that whether you'd explored it or not, because I thought it would have actually attached itself to people's mentality.
Like I said, it definitely works in motivating particular groups within our base of supporters to take action, yes.
Cool, and I did send you an email to get a copy of the presentation as well.
Okay.
So. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments? Yep.
Sorry, I missed the start of your talk, so if you covered this, I apologise. But do you have any kind of recommendations on the settings or how to undertake these kind of persuasive conversations? Is it better with family and friends around the kitchen table, or writing letters to your local MP?
So I couldn't quite hear the question, but I think it was, are there particular places that I'd recommend for having these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, the settings, or I guess also the types of people that members of the public could be more persuasive with. Is it better to have these conversations in more informal settings, like in a family context, or writing letters to your local government official kind of thing?
It's a great question. I mean, my short answer would be that there's no bad place to have a conversation about the legalisation of cannabis. Yes, it's absolutely important that those conversations happen in private settings with your family, among friends, that kind of thing. Absolutely. Our messaging recommendations aren't necessarily directed towards any particular context. We're trying to make them as broadly relevant, because those conversations also need to happen in media. We need to have politicians who support reform talking in a way that's consistent. It has to happen across multiple different settings. So essentially the answer is yes to everything. It has to be in the way we talk to MPs. It has to be in lobbying meetings. It has to be in other places where, for example, in the text of petitions that the members of the public might sign and then take to politicians. We need to have ideally a language that is threaded through every form of communication about cannabis legalisation, and that they all sing from a similar sort of song sheet. I mean, it's no mean feat to generate that kind of alignment, but that's the dream.
Oh, here we go. We have another question over here. Coming over.
Hey, how you going?
Good, thank you.
Excellent to hear. Yeah, okay, so that was an excellent talk, first of all. Thanks very much. And I think they're going to be really salient points, if an actual referendum comes around, or we get to a point where we are having to persuade people en masse around a very kind of binary yes or no. And I really liked your point, particularly around the fact that you know, there aren't these traditional fault lines, that already we have a kind of leaning towards more yes than no for support. What do you think are the key things at the moment stopping the major parties wanting to bring this conversation more to light and actually getting this to the point where the public is discussing it more themselves to push it forward?
Yeah, great question. The biggest barrier stopping politicians engaging is that they're not feeling enough pressure from members of the public. They're only going to move if they're forced to, right? There's plenty of people within parliaments, including in the major parties, particularly Labor, who think that cannabis law reform absolutely makes sense. But, you know, they've got a lot of other issues that they are dealing with, members of the community bringing all sorts of concerns. There are other things that are hot issues in the media and all that. We need to cut through, and the only way to get their attention is if that big group of supporters, that 55% of Australians who say they support legalisation, are actually organised and mobilised to put focused pressure onto politicians so that they're forced to take action. Because they want to also have a protective environment around them when they move, so that when they say, yeah, we're going to go for this, we're going to legalise cannabis, they need to be sure that there's actually going to be a broad group of the public who are going to back them in, alongside the kind of people who they'll want to stand next to in making those kinds of announcements. You know, people from the legal profession or the medical profession or that kind of thing. And so if we can demonstrate to them that the evidence, the experts and the community are all aligned on this, and they're not just hearing that like in the abstract, but they're hearing it every day in the form of phone calls to their offices, etc., then that's when we'll see action.
And following on from that, the pressure that must start being exerted by the electorate actually electing now legalised cannabis, you know, people to state parliament. So that, to me, appears to be maybe a little bit of a clincher, because some of these bigger parties should notice that it's an electoral issue, and it's in fact one that's taken votes away from other parties.
Yeah, definitely. And look, you can see the shift that's happened in Victoria since the election of legalised cannabis candidates to the upper house there. When we talk to when we talk to media, to journalists in Victoria, you don't have to convince them anymore that cannabis legalisation is an issue that they should pay attention to. There's a taken for grantedness about it, because it's just established as part of the political agenda in Victoria now. And I think we'll see the same sort of thing happen here in New South Wales with the election of Jeremy Buckingham to, you know, a legislative council where there are then many other parties, Liberal Democrats, Animal Justice and the Greens, also supporting cannabis law reform. So yeah, it's absolutely shifting the political dynamics around this issue. But also, like, it's insufficient. Like, it's not enough in itself. And, you know, I know the legalised cannabis MPs absolutely understand this, that there needs to be that pressure from outside the parliament in the form of a social movement that is strengthening the work that's going on within parliaments with that additional kind of pressure. And to be honest, like, we sometimes, I think, in this movement beat ourselves up a bit about how long it's taken to actually achieve legislative change. And honestly, one of the biggest barriers that we're faced in that is the lack of investment in social justice campaigning on this issue. Other similar sorts of law reforms, for example, around voluntary assisted dying, came off the back of an immense amount of fundraising that was then directed into really targeted campaigns that were able to collect up and then mobilise the community in parallel with a whole bunch of lobbying work. All that takes time and money. And so one of the big barriers that we've faced, and thankfully this is beginning to shift, we're seeing people come into this space to support the kind of campaigning work that we need, but that's been one of the biggest barriers, and I think one of the things that's really slowed down the pace of reform on this issue.
Absolutely. Any other comments or questions from our beautiful audience? Everyone's gone outside to watch the Combi Convoy, I think, Will.
Yeah,
okay.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your attention and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.